Hello, I'm Jorge Leal, Assistant Professor of Mexican American History at UC Riverside. So, thinking of the work that Christina Fernandez has done and how her photography intersects with history, and in particular with the history of Mexican Americans in the U.S. So I'm always drawn back to Maria's Great Expedition series, in particular because of the connections that she makes of her own personal history with the history of migration from Mexico to the U.S. in the 20th century. For instance, in the photo, 1927, going back to Morelia. And here she's tracing the journey that her grandmother took from the state of Michoacan, from a ranchito close to Morelia, and during the Mexican Revolution. And she memorializes some of the places where her grandmother settled temporarily, stopped by temporarily in her journey to the US. And going back to Morelia, has the attributes of giving us a different facet, which is the facet of going back and forth between the US, now the place where her grandmother made a living, grew roots, created a family, and her city, her place of origin, which is Michoacan. And sometimes when we think of the history of Mexican migration, we think of the journey north. But few times we think of the circular migration, these trips of going back and forth. And why is it that immigrants are able to do this, or sometimes they're not able to do this? And I think that Christina Fernandez, in this reenactment of herself, reenacting the travel of her grandmother, gives us that other side of migration, of the longing, the missing home, missing family, and how one tries to make up for time in their place of origin. On this image where she's next to the tracks, again mimicking her grandmother, we can see a lot of cues by looking at the photo. For example, besides the tracks, we see that big boxy luggage, her needing something. So we see el estambre, the knitting material. We also see perhaps tickets or directions. But we see how Christina embodies her grandma and the face of looking forward perhaps to adventure, but also perhaps the fatigue of the travel. So there's so much that we can think of when we see this photo of longing, of uncertainty. So I always have seen this image, and it reminds me of my own personal migration story, my own personal experiences with being back and forth. And so I think that that's why, for me, this as a historian, this photograph connects those many different threads, the personal with the professional historian in me. But I think for audiences, it also reflects that the constant movement of that migration brings about. And for one, the excitement, the relief to travel home, but also the anxieties of what would I find after years of absence. And so for me, this photo, being, yes, a reenactment, is able to portray many of those facets. And what I think that it's genius of Christina is that to do this series, and also to do this photo, she delved heavily into the history of Mexican migration, the Mexican American experience, to be able to compose, to create the pioneer historian Vicky Ruiz, to be able to have this very solid background on the conditions of traveling, particularly for women. When we think of migration, we think of particularly migration from Mexico to the US, we think of men, we think of the braceros. And it's yes, it is a history of migration, but it is normally seen in gender lenses of a mainly male migration. Yet we know women also migrated alongside with her partners, her husbands, but a lot of times they migrated by themselves. And this is the case at different points of Christina's grandmother, that she migrates, yes, first with a husband, but then that relationship fizzles. And she takes the decision of migrating, continue to migrate as a mother and as a woman, as a single woman. And we can just imagine the many different difficulties and challenges that she encountered, be it racism for being a Mexican immigrant, perhaps monolingual, perhaps speaking English but with an accent. We can think of also the way that when she migrated and how she was received by white Americans, the racism that she might have encountered. So I think that these photos open up the query and allows us to see something that we normally don't see, because in the canon of photography of Mexican migration, normally we see men. So the photos that we see from this period of migration from the 1920s, starting with the Mexican Revolution and how the Mexican Revolution creates this influx of migration of people fleeing the revolution, we see men boarding train cars. During the 1930s and the Mexican repatriation, we see women, perhaps with kids, but men at the forefront, quote unquote, repatriated, sent to Mexico. And I say sent to Mexico, not sent back to Mexico, because likely the parents might have been born in Mexico, but the children were US citizens whose rights in effect were suspended during Mexican repatriation. And then we move into the Bracero program of created during World War II in order to remedy the lack of mano de obra, the lack of workers due to World War II in the US. And those photos of Mexican immigrants coming to the US during World War II and afterwards, it's mostly men. But Christina Fernandez gives us this other view into this history by reenacting trips that her grandma took, the experiences that her grandmother likely had in the Southwest. And ultimately, what this photo is part of is this expedition. So turning the whole, what it is, and to be be part of an expedition that is not only men or European men in an expedition, getting to know, being part of the landscape of the American Southwest, but that it could be women, and likely there were women like Christina Fernandez's grandmother, who had to make the trip, had to overcome a myriad of challenges to be able to live a more fulfilling life, and also to provide for her children. And it is the hope that I think that Christina shares in these photos of her grandmother living a full life beyond just being a laborer, but a full life as a woman in this long journey of migration.